There was something about the way the morning light hit that cafe window that made everything feel colder than it should have. Maybe it was the fog curling against the glass, or maybe it was just me. I parked a few blocks down, needing the extra walk to clear my head. I'd barely slept the night before. Not from nerves. No, I was confident in what I was bringing, but because this meeting felt like a turning point. After months of late nights and quiet sacrifices, this was going to be the moment things shifted. For me. For the company. For Sarah and me, I thought. The folder in my hand was thicker than it should have been. I double-checked every figure, ran projections against last year's numbers, even stress-tested it against market shifts. This was the kind of work I used to be proud of. The kind Sarah used to brag about to her father. Evan doesn't miss details, she used to say. He sees angles no one else does. Back then, it sounded like admiration. Lately, I wasn't so sure. I walked through the front door of the cafe, our spot, once upon a time. We used to come here on Sundays. She'd order the avocado toast, I'd get the breakfast skillet and steal bites of hers when she wasn't looking. We talked about the future back then. Vacations we couldn't yet afford. The dream of turning Harper and Bloom into a West Coast institution. Her family legacy, she called it. Ours, I used to believe. That morning, the place didn't feel like ours anymore. Sarah was already seated at the table in the back corner. It used to be her favorite, the one with the little hanging plant above and the draft that she always complained about but secretly liked. She looked perfect, as always. I noticed she wore her hair back in that precise, almost surgical bun she saved for investor meetings. Her blazer looked new. Pale blue, pressed to hell. I recognized the look. It was the look she wore when she needed to be untouchable. Across from her sat Emily. That alone should have been my second warning. Emily never showed up for anything that didn't have a camera or a bottom line involved. She offered a tight-lipped smile that felt more like a formality than a greeting. I smiled anyway, doing my best to keep things warm. "Morning," I said, setting the folder down on the table between us. "Hope you're hungry. I brought a monster of a proposal." Neither of them reached for the menus. Sarah didn't even look up from her coffee. I hesitated. "So, do we want to go over the revised distribution routes first or the onboarding strategy for?" Emily cut me off, folding her hands like she was about to read a eulogy. "Evan, we need to talk." That was the third warning. 3 words that always mean something else. My stomach dropped before she finished her sentence. "We've discussed it with the board, and we've come to the conclusion that your role at Harper and Bloom is no longer viable moving forward." I stared at her for a full second before laughing, because I honestly thought she was joking. "Wait, what?" Sarah didn't react. Not even a flicker of discomfort. Just a sip of coffee. That quiet hit me harder than anything. Emily went on, her tone clinical. "Your recent initiatives have drawn significant concerns. Budget overruns, inefficiencies, delays with implementation. The board feels your division is becoming a resource drain." I blinked. My mind was still trying to catch up. "A resource drain?" I repeated, my voice low. "You mean the division that increased fulfillment speed by 22% last quarter? The one that landed the Pendleton contract?" Sarah looked up finally, her expression unreadable. "Evan, it's not personal." "Not personal." The phrase made my skin crawl. I looked at her, really looked. "You couldn't even pick up the phone? After everything I've done? You let her do this?" She didn't flinch. This was a collective decision. "No, it wasn't," I said quietly, because I knew Walter, her father, wouldn't have signed off on this. He built the company on loyalty and trust. On the idea that family didn't just mean blood, it meant belief. Walter was old school that way. He may have handed Sarah and Emily titles, but he kept the soul of the company close to his chest. And I knew damn well he didn't approve this. Emily cleared her throat, already gathering her purse like we were done here. "We'll ensure your severance is processed quickly. You'll get a statement by Monday." The waiter approached the table, 2 plates balanced in his hands. Pancakes and eggs for Emily. Avocado toast for Sarah. Nothing for me. I never got the chance to order. They both nodded politely, but neither touched their food. I pushed the folder across the table, slow and deliberate. "You should still read it," I said. Might be useful. Someday. No one reached for it. I stood up without another word. My chair scraped back, loud in the quiet cafe. No one stopped me. No one said thank you, or sorry, or anything at all. Outside, the wind hit harder than I remembered. I walked fast, but I didn't go far. Just around the block, down toward the waterfront where the air smelled like salt and diesel. I found a bench and sat there, folder still under my arm, heart pounding against my ribs like it was trying to break free. They thought they had stripped me of everything. My title, my influence, my place in the company I helped reshape. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't have known, was that they just made a mistake. A big one. Because when you push someone out without checking the fine print, you better be damn sure they don't have anything left to hold on to. And I did. I had the clause. The one thing they forgot. And they were about to learn just how bad they'd screwed up. Back at the house, I dropped the folder onto the kitchen counter with a thud that felt too loud for the silence waiting for me. The place was still, like it hadn't caught up to what just happened. It was ridiculous how quiet everything felt. You'd think after a blow like that, the walls would creak, the foundation would groan, something, anything, to match what was going on in my chest. But nothing. Just the dull hum of the fridge and the faint echo of my own disbelief. I made a pot of coffee even though I didn't want any. Just needed to do something with my hands. Stirring cream into the mug, I stared out the window toward the bay. It was gray out. Flat water, no wind. No movement. Same kind of day Sarah always said made her feel centered. I used to believe her when she said stuff like that. Now I wasn't sure if anything she said was ever real. My phone buzzed on the counter. I ignored it at first. Probably someone from the office. Probably a condolence text disguised as concern. When it buzzed again, I glanced down. It wasn't a name I expected to see. I hadn't heard from Joe in almost a year. He'd retired after Walter stepped down, some quiet departure with no party, no fanfare. Said he was done with the family drama. Couldn't blame him. But the timing of his message made me stop cold. Evan, check the 2019 merger contract. Look at the clause tied to Bloom Logic. You'll understand why I'm reaching out. That was it. No context, no explanation. Just that. But it was enough to shake something loose in my memory. Bloom Logic. Back in 2019, Harper & Bloom acquired a tiny tech firm that specialized in supply chain optimization software. Nothing flashy. Just 3 developers and a sleek logistics platform with way more potential than people realized at the time. Sarah's family didn't see it, but I did. I pushed for the acquisition. Negotiated every term myself. Integrated their platform into our core operations over the next year and made sure it quietly powered everything behind the scenes: inventory control, fulfillment, shipping algorithms, vendor analytics, all of it. Bloom Logic was the spine of Harper & Bloom. And I remembered the deal came with a contract. One I hadn't thought about in years. The mug slipped from my hand and clinked against the counter, spilling hot coffee across the granite. I didn't even flinch. Just wiped it with a kitchen towel and turned toward the basement stairs. I knew exactly where to look. Down in the basement, beneath boxes of old holiday decorations and wedding keepsakes we never unpacked after the move, sat my old project files. Dusty, forgotten, untouched. I pulled out 3 banker boxes before I found it, labeled in my handwriting, HNB plus Bloom Logic 2019. The folder was in the back, inside a plastic sleeve, still crisp. I flipped through the pages until my eyes landed on a section I'd barely glanced at when the ink was fresh. At the time, all I cared about was getting the deal through. I didn't pay attention to the legal language beyond the key financials. But Joe had. Executive partner, Evan T. Martin shall retain full and exclusive control over Bloom Logic LLC, including but not limited to all operational decisions, licensing agreements, source code distribution, digital architecture, and proprietary integration within Harper & Bloom systems. No unilateral transfer or reassignment of these rights may be executed without written consent from said executive partner. I read that paragraph 3 times, slower each time. My pulse climbed with every word. They didn't just fire me. They fired the one person who controlled the digital nerve center of the entire company. Everything Every shipment, every forecast, every vendor contract that relied on the platform was bottlenecked through the system I had the keys to. The moment I walked out of that cafe and they tried to keep going without me, they'd basically shut the engine off on a moving truck. They didn't just cut me out. They locked themselves out. My hands shook as I closed the folder. Joe was right. I hadn't understood until now. They thought they were boxing me out, pushing me aside like dead weight. But they hadn't read the fine print. And now, the platform they built their entire next phase on? The digital system they couldn't operate a single distribution center without? They couldn't touch it. Not without me. I walked back upstairs in a fog. The house still smelled like coffee and rain. I stood in the living room staring out at the bay for a long time. The silence didn't feel heavy anymore. It felt like the start of something. They thought they'd cut me out. What they actually did was give me more power than I ever had sitting at that boardroom table. And the best part? I wasn't going to tell them. Not yet. Let them scramble. Let them realize piece by piece that they couldn't function without me. Let the calls start. Let the panic set in. I wasn't going to lift a finger. I wasn't going to rage or send threats or beg for my seat back. I was going to wait. And when the cracks started to show, I'd be right here, holding the only key they forgot existed. And this time, I wasn't coming back on their terms. I was coming back on mine. The next morning, my phone rang before sunrise. I let it go to voicemail. It rang again. Then again. Different numbers. Office lines. Extensions I hadn't dialed in months. I sat in bed, staring at the ceiling while it buzzed on the nightstand. The calls weren't coming from Sarah or Emily, they were from people deeper in the machine. People who didn't know yet that they were standing on a rug that had already been yanked out from under them. At 7:02, the name that finally made me answer flashed across the screen. Walter. I let it ring twice, then picked up. Morning, Walter. There was a pause, too long to be casual. When he spoke, his voice wasn't angry. It wasn't calm either. It was sharp. Shaken. Evan, I need to know what the hell's going on. I stayed silent. I got a call from two of our biggest vendors this morning. They said our system blocked their login credentials. One of them thought it was a cyber attack. Then I tried logging in through the master panel myself and got booted. Can't access a single thing. What did you do? I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it had taken less than 24 hours. I didn't do anything, I said. Not yet. Another pause. Not yet. I stood up, phone in hand, and walked to the window overlooking the bay. Same view. Different world now. You might want to check the merger file from 2019. Look for the clause tied to Bloom Logic. It's all there, Walter. I'm still the sole operational authority. I never signed it away. A low exhale came through the phone. Son of a bitch. That was about the reaction I expected. He didn't yell. Didn't threaten. Walter wasn't like that. He was old school. When he got quiet, it meant something was sinking in. Something deep. Did Sarah and Emily know about this? He finally asked. If they did, they were too arrogant to care. If they didn't, well, that's almost worse, isn't it? There was a long silence. I could hear him shifting papers on his end, maybe already reaching for the contract, flipping through to confirm the truth. You're saying the company can't run without you? I'm saying it hasn't been able to for a while. I just never had to prove it until now. Walter muttered something under his breath I couldn't catch. Then clear, Jesus, they've already approved press for the expansion next quarter. Logistics is the centerpiece. If we can't process the back-end data, you won't ship. You won't forecast. You won't even invoice correctly. Another silence. Why didn't you say anything yesterday? I let out a slow breath. Because when someone kicks you out of a room you built with your own hands, you don't bang on the door to get back in. You let them realize they bricked themselves inside. Walter didn't respond to that. Let me be clear, Evan, he said finally. I didn't know what they were planning. I wouldn't have signed off on that decision. Not in a million years. I figured. You got a lawyer? I don't need one. Not yet. You planning on making this ugly? I thought about that. I really did. I thought about showing up at the next board meeting with a cease and desist order. I thought about watching Sarah squirm while Emily tried to spin it like I was being unreasonable. But none of that really interested me. I wasn't after revenge. I was after control. No, Walter, I said finally. I'm planning on letting it bleed. He didn't push back. Maybe he understood. Maybe, deep down, a part of him even respected it. When we hung up, I stared out the window for a long time. I wasn't sure what I expected to feel, vindication, maybe. A little satisfaction. But instead it was quiet, steady, like waiting for a storm I already knew the shape of. By that afternoon, the fallout had started. My inbox, which I hadn't touched all day, lit up with messages. Department heads, project managers, regional team leaders. Confused. Frantic. Then angry. Systems were glitching. Requests weren't going through. Contracts weren't auto-renewing. Shipments were sitting in warehouses, unconfirmed. On paper, everything looked intact. But nothing was moving. And nobody could figure out why. Except me. And I wasn't saying a word. At 6:37 p.m., I got a message from Emily. Blunt. Cold as usual. We need to talk. This can't continue. I didn't reply. At 7:15, another message from Sarah. This one, different. I didn't know. I swear. I thought this was just about reallocation, not a full separation. Please call me. I stared at her name for a long time. Read the message again. Then locked my phone and set it face down on the table. Let them stew. Let them go through the same silence they handed me yesterday, plate of untouched food and all. Joe called later that night. They're scrambling, he said, chuckling low. 3 legal teams from 3 firms combing through old contracts trying to find a loophole. But you wrote it too clean, Evan. They're not gonna find a way around it. I smiled, but it didn't reach my eyes. Good. You know, I always told Walter you were sharper than they gave you credit for. They didn't want sharp. They wanted obedient. Joe was quiet for a beat. So what's next? I didn't answer right away. I poured myself a drink, sat on the couch, and looked around the house. The same house Sarah and I picked out together. The one we painted room by room after the deal closed in 2020. The one with her books still on the shelf, her coats still by the door. It should have hurt more. But it didn't. Not anymore. I'm gonna let them keep running in circles, I said. Then I'll see who calls when the real pressure starts. You think Sarah will come around? I took a sip. I think she already has. But it's too late for that. Joe didn't press. By the time I went to bed, 3 more emails had come through. One was from a vendor I knew personally. He wasn't mad, he was just confused. Wanted to know if someone could please explain why his monthly payment bounced back flagged as invalid. I smiled to myself. I wasn't sabotaging anything. I hadn't touched a single thing. All I did was stop lifting the weight I'd been holding up for years. And already, everything was starting to crack. The next few days felt like watching a slow-motion implosion. Not a fiery explosion, not yet. Just steady cracks, splintering outward from the moment I walked out of that cafe. The messages kept coming. Emails turned to texts. Texts turned to calls. The silence I gave them? It was deafening. And the longer I held it, the more frantic they became. Monday afternoon, I heard from Diane in procurement. She'd always been decent to me, respectful. Her message was carefully worded, trying not to take sides. She just needed clarity on why vendor payments weren't processing and why BloomLogic's approval tree was suddenly redirecting all permissions to a suspended admin account, mine. I could almost hear her confusion bleeding through the screen. They had tried to cut me out but forgot to check whether I had the power to lock the doors behind me. The truth was, I hadn't touched the system. Not once. I didn't need to. The clause in the merger contract automatically kicked in the moment my executive access was revoked without my consent. Joe once called it a dead man's switch, though that felt too dramatic at the time. Now, watching the chaos unfold, it felt eerily appropriate. They had no idea just how deep BloomLogic was embedded into the company's arteries. Everything depended on it. Product tracking, warehouse forecasting, regional distribution flow, order prioritization, freight routing, partner audits. You name it, BloomLogic touched it. And without my approval, nothing was updating, nothing was moving. It was like trying to run a modern factory with the power cut at the main breaker. Late Tuesday, Joe called again. He was practically giddy. "You're not gonna believe this," he said, his voice buzzing through my speaker as I stood in the garage, trying to clear out old boxes. "They just postponed the Northern California launch. Press releases pulled, vendor invites canceled." Sarah signed off on a public system outage statement. I leaned against the workbench and smiled faintly. That didn't take long. "I'm hearing from people inside. Half the directors are looking for external work. The VPs are fighting each other in Slack threads. Emily sent out a memo saying the delays are temporary, that they're exploring alternative logistics vendors." I let out a low laugh. There are no alternatives. At least, not ones that can replace what I built. Joe didn't disagree. "What's your move?" "Nothing. Not yet." And I meant it. I wasn't in a rush. I was letting gravity do the work. Every time I didn't reply, every day I didn't reach out, the more desperate they became. And in that vacuum, I started hearing from people I didn't expect. People I thought had written me off the moment I was ousted. Like Leanne. She'd always been smart, forward-thinking. She ran regional marketing, always had my back when I pushed for BloomLogic's integration. She sent a short email, no fluff. "Heard what happened. I'm sorry. Just know, if you build something new, I'd love to be part of it." That message hit differently. It didn't beg. It didn't try to rewrite the past. It just acknowledged what was happening and offered something real. I stared at her message for a long time. My thumb hovered over the reply button. I wasn't sure why I hesitated, maybe because it felt like the beginning of something. Something bigger than just pushing back. I wasn't just the guy who got screwed over anymore. I was the guy they needed. And maybe, just maybe, I could be more than that. By Wednesday, the cracks were widening. I heard Sarah was spending all day in closed-door meetings. Emily had gone uncharacteristically silent, which told me everything I needed to know. She only disappeared when things were unraveling and she couldn't spin fast enough to keep up. That night, around 9, my phone buzzed. "Sarah." "Finn." I didn't answer. A minute later, a text came through. "Please. We need to talk. Not as business partners. Just us." That word didn't mean what it used to. Still, something in me stirred. I got up, paced the kitchen a few times, poured a glass of water I didn't touch. Then, against my better judgment, I replied. "Same cave. Tomorrow." "Vim." She answered instantly. "I'll be there." I barely slept that night. Not because I didn't know what I was going to say, but because I did. I knew exactly how this would go. The old me, the one who sat in that cafe with a folder and hope in his chest, he might have flinched. He might have forgiven. But that guy was gone. And what she'd get tomorrow would be something colder, steadier, and far less forgiving. I showed up 10 minutes early again. Habit. I sat at a different table this time, away from the corner. She arrived right on time, her posture tight, her hair down this time like she wanted to seem softer. It didn't work. "Evan," she said, sitting down across from me. I didn't say anything. Just stared. She didn't bother with small talk. "I made a mistake," she said, her voice quiet. "I didn't understand the full scope of your position with BloomLogic. I let Emily push me into something I wasn't comfortable with, and now we're watching everything fall apart." I sipped my coffee. She tried to smile. "You don't have to say anything. I know what we did was wrong. But the company's breaking apart, Evan. You built so much of it. And we need you. I need you." The words hung in the air between us. I finally spoke. "You didn't defend me. You didn't ask questions. You sat there and let her do it. I was gone before I even opened my mouth." "I know," she whispered. She reached into her bag and slid a folder across the table. "These are the documents we need approved to restore access to our distribution center workflows. If you could." I put my hand over the folder but didn't open it. "No," I said. She blinked. "Evan, you made your choice. Now you live with it." She looked like she was about to cry, but I stood before she could say more. "For what it's worth," I said, grabbing my coat, "this might be the first time you've had to deal with consequences. I suggest you learn from it. Then I walked out. Let her sit in that cafe. Let her feel what I felt. She wasn't the one in control anymore. I was. The board meeting was set for Friday. Emergency session. Closed door. Walter was the one who called it, not Sarah or Emily. That was the first signal. The second was when I got the official invite, not as a courtesy, but as a voting participant. They hadn't just remembered the clause. They'd finally read it. Every word of it. And now, they needed to crawl back through a door they slammed shut in their rush to cut me out. The conference room looked exactly the same, but the mood was unrecognizable. Cold, stiff, uneasy. Emily wasn't there when I walked in. Her nameplate sat on the polished table, untouched. Sarah sat 2 seats away from it, pale and tense, eyes flicking to me and away again. Walter nodded as I entered, the only one who looked me in the eye. We skipped the formalities. Walter cleared his throat and jumped in like he'd rehearsed the speech 3 times already. As of this morning, our legal review confirms Evan's executive partnership over BloomLogic is legally binding, untransferable, and still fully in effect. That includes full control of our digital architecture, vendor systems, and intellectual property. Without his approval, Harper and Bloom cannot continue operations at scale. The room was quiet except for the sound of someone shifting uncomfortably in their chair. I let the silence stretch. Let the weight of it fill every corner of the space. Walter continued. Given these facts, I'm proposing the reinstatement of Evan Martin, not as head of operations, but as executive chairman of BloomLogic, with full strategic oversight and board voting power. Emily chose that moment to walk in. She looked like she hadn't slept. She scanned the room, saw me, saw the folder in Walter's hands, and froze. "You can't be serious," she said, her voice sharp raw. "This is insane. He's the one who crippled us." "No," Walter snapped, and for once, there was real anger in his voice. "You did that. You fired the one person keeping this place running because you didn't like that he had more influence than you." She opened her mouth, closed it, sat down slowly. She didn't say another word. Walter turned to me. "You accept the role?" I nodded once. "I do. But on my terms." And they agreed. The vote wasn't unanimous. Emily voted no, obviously, but it didn't matter. The rest of the board sided with Walter. Sarah never spoke during the whole thing. Just sat there, spine straight, face unreadable. When the motion passed, she looked down at her notes like she'd forgotten what they were. I walked out of that meeting not as a broken man clawing back relevance, but as the one holding the only keys that mattered. The weeks that followed were ruthless. I gutted the old structure. People who were loyal to ego instead of vision were let go. BloomLogic was rebuilt from the inside out. I brought in new blood. Joe came back as CFO on a limited contract. Leanne joined full-time as our new head of brand strategy. Within 2 months, contracts resumed. Vendors returned. The pipeline restarted. Sales stabilized. Then they grew. The office culture shifted. People stopped whispering in hallways. They started staying late again, not because they were scared, but because they believed in what we were doing. I made sure this time it wasn't about family names or dinner parties. It was about work, talent, vision, and results. Sarah remained in the company as COO, mostly because firing her would have created more drama than it was worth. She reported to me directly now. There were no more late-night strategy sessions at home. No stolen kisses between meetings. Our relationship became what it probably always was deep down. A working arrangement. Emily? She was gone. No farewell email. No last-minute speech. Just a resignation letter sent through legal and a brief LinkedIn post that read like she'd stepped down to pursue new opportunities. No one reached out to her. No one asked where she went. The machine kept moving without her. It took me 6 months to fully rewrite the governance bylaws. When I was done, Harper and Bloom was no longer a family-run business. It was a meritocracy. Every new policy was designed to make sure what happened to me could never happen again. Performance review overrides had to be unanimous. Firings required dual approval. And a new clause, ironclad, protected any partner who brought foundational innovation to the company. I named it after BloomLogic, But everyone knew the real reason it existed. Sarah never challenged the new rules. She showed up, submitted her reports, and left at exactly 6 p.m. every day. Whatever love we once had was gone. Not in a burst, not in a betrayal like I'd expected, but in the quiet erosion that comes from watching someone pick silence when it matters most. I kept the house on the bay. For a while, it felt like a museum of mistakes. Every room reminded me of the man who used to believe loyalty would protect him. But over time, that changed. The silence stopped feeling heavy. It started feeling like peace. Some nights, I'd sit out on the deck with a glass of something good, watching the water reflect the sky, and think about how close I came to losing everything. And how, by losing it, I got exactly what I needed. They thought they broke me over breakfast. But all they did was hand me control.